Hello, and welcome back to my Q&A video series about the pandas library in Python. And the question for today comes from a YouTube commenter who asks, can you make a video dedicated in pointing out the differences between loc, iloc, and ix? Okay, great question. So loc, iloc, and ix are different DataFrame methods for selecting rows and columns, and they're very flexible and powerful, so it's important to understand all three of them. So let's jump right in and use an example data set to explore these methods. So we'll import pandas as PD, and then we're going to use a data set of UFO reported sightings. So we'll say UFO equals pd.read CSV, and then bit.ly/UFO reports. Okay, you can always follow along with this at home. That's a public data set. Okay, so if you wanted to look at the first few rows, your natural inclination might be to use the head method. So if we want to see the first three rows, UFO.head 3, and that'll show us those first three rows. Okay, but there are lots of other ways to do this, and loc is one of them, and it's a lot more powerful and flexible. So let's try it out. Okay, so loc is, because it's a DataFrame method, you say UFO.loc, and loc is for filtering rows and selecting columns by label. And by label, I mean, for rows, I mean the index. For columns, I mean the column names. Okay, that's the label. So loc is for selecting things by label. Okay, so you don't use parentheses, you use a bracket. And the format of the loc command is what rows do I want, comma, what columns do I want. Okay, so if I want row 0 and all columns, I say this, UFO.loc bracket 0, comma, colon. So the colon means all columns. So row 0, all columns. We run that, and we actually get a backup pandas series, which is just showing us this first row of the data frame. So row 0, meaning this one, all columns. Okay. Now, what if I wanted multiple rows? Okay, I could say UFO.loc, and what rows do I want? Let's say I want rows 0, 1, and 2. I could actually just pass a list 0, 1, 2, and then outside of those brackets, comma, colon. So which rows do I want? 0, 1, 2. Which columns do I want? All of them. Okay, and here we go. Now, there's actually a more efficient way, because we want this continuous block of rows. Okay, I could say you can actually just use UFO.loc colon 2, comma, colon. So which rows do I want? 0 through 2. And I want all columns. So I run that, get the same thing. Okay, so this is what you would use when you want a block of them together, but you can use the list format. You know, I could have put 0, 1, 3 and gotten those rows. Okay, now you'll notice that when I use this notation, it's inclusive on both sides. It's 0, 1, and 2. It does not exclude the 2 like it would with range. Okay, so that's really important to remember, that loc is inclusive on both sides when you use this notation. Okay, now I will mention, I'm not going to recommend you do this, but I will mention that sometimes you'll see code like this, and you'll think, wait a minute, I thought it was rows, comma, columns. And that's true, but it turns out if you leave off the, comma, colon, pandas just assumes it. and it will return the same result. Now I'm going to ask you or recommend that you don't do that, because as the Python philosophy is, explicit is better than implicit. So even though this might look a little nicer, just do a favor for the person reading your code and show them, okay, I want these rows, I want all columns. Okay. Now, that's for doing row selection. What about column selection? It's just like you might expect. Okay. So we're going to say ufo.loc, and first we're going to start with all rows, column city. Okay. And we get back the city series. Okay. All rows, what column? City. And as before, if we wanted multiple columns, we could do something like this. I could say I want city and state. So which rows? All of them. Which columns? City and state. And we get that. Now we get the data frame with 2 columns. Or I can instead specify it as a range. I want city through state. All rows, city through state. So city, colors reported, shape reported, state. Okay. So, you can of course combine these two in terms of row selection and column selection. So if I want rows 0 through 2 and columns city through state, I can do it that way. Okay. So very flexible. And I'd ask you real quick, what's another way we could do this? This exact same thing without using the loc method. Think about that for a second. Pause the video if you need. But if you remember back to previous videos, you could accomplish this same thing with ufo.head3 and then .drop time axis equals 1. Okay. So same thing, totally different kind of workflow. The point here is there are always lots of ways to do the same thing in pandas, and it comes down to what methods you feel most comfortable with and you know the best. I'll just say that .loc is super powerful and flexible. So, okay. There's another use for loc that's useful to know, and it's using loc with Boolean conditions. Okay, so previously I've said that if you want to select all rows where, for instance, city equals Oakland, you would do this: UFO bracket UFO.city equals Oakland. And you probably remember this from a previous video where city is Oakland. Okay. However, you can do the same thing with loc, and it's even a bit more flexible. So I could say UFO.loc, and then what do we need to tell it? What rows do I want? Well, the rows in which UFO.city equals Oakland. What columns do I want? All of them. Okay. So that produces the same results. It's just a bit more explicit. Now you'll see a lot of code, mine included, that does it like this, but you should be aware of this. And in fact, it's again more flexible because you could specify, oh, I just want the state column. Okay, and you just get the state. Now, you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, I don't need .loc to do that. I can just add on .state at the end here. And you're right. However, there's actually a subtle difference in how this code and this code executes. This is known as chained indexing, and it will cause problems under certain scenarios. I'll mention it in a future video, but this will not cause problems. So if you're doing a Boolean selection of rows and then a selection of columns, this accomplishes it in one internal operation, whereas this takes 2 operations, and because of that, this is safer for your code executing in the way you want. And as I said, I'll talk about that more in a future video. Okay. So that's it for loc. Let's talk a little bit about iloc. All right. So iloc is for filtering rows and selecting columns by integer position. That's what the I stands for, is integer position. So I can say ufo.iloc, and it's just like before. What rows do I want? What columns do I want? So if I said I want all rows and I want columns in position 0 and 3, I will get the city and state columns because that's position 0, that's position 3, the data frame. Okay. As before, I can also use a range. And let's say I say 0:4. Okay. You might not have expected this, but you'll notice it shows you the columns, and let's just remind you of the columns, ufo.columns. It shows you the columns in positions 0, 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so with iloc, it is exclusive of the second number, inclusive of the first number. Okay, this is just like if we do range 0 to 4, it comes out with 0, 1, 2, 3. Same thing. So when you're using iloc, it's exclusive of this one. Okay, whereas with .loc, it's inclusive on both sides. Okay, really important to remember. Okay, so let me show you one more example of iloc, and ufo.iloc 0:3, everything. So I want rows 0, 1, and 2, and all columns. Okay, so it did not include row 3. All right, so that's a big difference between loc and iloc. So loc for labels, iloc for integer position. Loc, when you do ranges, it's inclusive on both sides. Iloc, inclusive on the start and exclusive of the stop. Okay. All right, I'm going to show you a couple shortcuts that I don't recommend using, but I want you to be aware of them because you'll see them in a lot of code online. Okay, you might even see them in my code occasionally. Okay, so one of them is if you've learned before how to select multiple columns, you've probably seen this. UFO bracket city, comma, state. Okay, and that is one way to select two columns. And basically the inner brackets represent a list. So this is a list of strings. If you pass a list of strings to the outer brackets, it knows you want to select columns. But that's a lot of logic to remember. What I recommend instead is just to use .loc and say, which rows, all of them, which columns do I want, city and state. Okay, so this is what I recommend because it's very explicit about what you want. Similarly, you're often going to see this, which I find confusing, which is UFO bracket 0:2. There's no .loc, there's no iloc, it's just 0:2. And you might think, is that referring to rows? Is that referring to columns? Are those labels? Are those integer positions? I don't know. And when you run it, you'll see it's actually referring to rows, and it's referring to them by integer position. But you'd have to memorize that logic, and anything where the logic is not totally clear, you want to stay away from it. You're better off, if you wanted to do this, you could do .iloc. This is much better, because you know, okay, position 0 through 2, inclusive, exclusive, and then all columns. Okay. Now let's move to IX. And what is IX? It allows you to mix labels and integers when when doing selection. So it's kind of like a blend between loc and iloc. Okay. So to demonstrate this one, I'm going to pull in another data set, the drinks data set we've seen many times. So drinks equals pd.read csv bit.ly y/drinks by country, and index call equals country. You can actually set the index when you're reading in the file. Okay. So if we look at the head, here's what we've got. Okay. So here's our index, and here are our 5 columns. Okay. So let's say I want to select this cell right here. Okay. So you can actually do selection by label and position and mix it up. So if I say drinks.ix, I can say Albania, which is a label. It is the label of this row, comma 0. And there's no 0 label here. 0 refers to the position of the column. And we get 89. Okay. Now, we could also do drinks.ix, and we could say 1, comma, beer servings. And in this case, the 1 refers to the position of the row, and beer servings is the label. In other words, ix has to figure out whether you're referring to a position or a label. Okay, it has to guess. So if you want to use ix, you have to remember their logic. Okay. Now let's do one more with ix. Drinks.ix, and we'll say Albania through Andorra, and we'll say 0:2. Okay. So we get Albania through Andorra, that's label selection, and 0:2. And it only shows us 2 columns. Now, why is that? Because the logic of ix is as follows. If you have a string index, which is what we have right here, okay, and you use numbers, those numbers are treated as positions. Positions, if you remember from iloc, it's inclusive of position 0 and exclusive of position 2. Okay? So, you have to remember that logic. Now, here's one more example of ix, and this is a confusing one. Drinks.ix, 0:2, 0:2. Actually, instead of using for drinks, let's actually do UFO. That's what I meant to do. Okay. So isn't this funny? I said 0 through 2, and it gave me 3 rows, 0 through 2, and it gave me 2 columns. Well, we already knew it was going to give us 2 columns because we saw that up here. You have a string index, meaning the dot columns, and you give it numbers, it will do it by position. If you have an integer index and you give it numbers, it will treat it as labels. And when using labels, it is inclusive on both sides. Okay? Now, if you're at this point confused, you're not alone. Okay? ix has been around for a while. It's very common in sample code on the internet, but I generally don't recommend it because you have to keep track of the intricate logic of ix. Okay? ix was invented in pandas before loc and iloc. That's why lots of people got used to using ix, but I only recommend using ix if you have to. If loc is not meeting your needs and iloc is not meeting your needs, and you need to mix positions and labels in the same call, then use ix. Otherwise, use loc or iloc. Okay? And it gets especially confusing when you have an integer index that doesn't start at 0 and it doesn't have sequential numbers, which is allowed, it could be ID numbers or something like that, then you're really going to get confused about what to expect, and you never want to write code that you can't even remember how it is going to work. Okay? So, usually I end with a bonus. There's no bonus today. Instead, I have a couple announcements. First announcement is because of some upcoming travel. Namely, I'm getting married soon. I'm going to be releasing videos only on Tuesdays, not on Tuesdays and Thursdays for a while, probably for June and July. Okay, so just one video per week. Second thing is, if you've never looked in the description below each video, check it out. I have links to documentation that's relevant. I have links to resources that might be helpful to you. There's a link to the GitHub repository where all this code is stored. So the code from every single one of these videos, there's about 19 videos already, and the code is in there in this GitHub repository, well commented in an IPython notebook, so you can use that as a reference. So there's a link below. Check that out. And the final announcement for today is, in case you did not know, I have an email newsletter. If you like these videos, do me a favor, go scroll down into the description, find the link that says newsletter, click on that, and go ahead and join my newsletter list, and I'll be sending you lots of great content on data science. Okay? So I'd love to have you part of the Data School community. All right, that is it for today. Thanks for sticking with me, and I hope to see you again soon.